Andrew Jackson was a justice on the Tennessee Supreme Court, a member of the House of Representatives, a senator, a general, and the President of the United States. He is probably best known, however, for defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He was our first president to actually grow up in poverty. He was born in Waxhaw Settlement between North and South Carolina. His father died weeks before he was born from a logging accident. His mother moved in with her sister and he was raised there. Jackson and his brother both served in the Revolutionary War as couriers and scouts. Andrew was only 13 years old. They were captured and brought to a British prisoner of war camp. They caught smallpox and were malnourished. When a British officer told Jackson to clean the officer's shoes, Jackson refused. The officer drew a sword and sliced Jackson in the face and the hand. He would have these scars for the rest of his life. They were released in a prisoner exchange, but his brother would die shortly after returning home. Jackson's mother volunteered as a nurse to American prisoners being held on a British warship. She caught cholera on that warship and died. At 14, Jackson was an orphan with a bitter, bitter hatred for the British. He studied law and would be admitted to the North Carolina bar in 1787. Jackson was wild as a young man, spending much of his time drinking, fighting, and gambling. Jackson moved to Nashville to practice law. He also did some land speculating. Back then, Nashville was a small western town, and it was still part of North Carolina. In Nashville, Jackson met Rachel Donaldson Robards, who was still married. She assumed that her former husband had secured a divorce, but he had not. There was little communication between the two because it was an abusive relationship. Not only was she not divorced, she and Jackson got married. They were remarried in 1794 after a divorce was secured. This led to accusations in Jackson's political career of being a bigamist and a slanderer. They bought land and lived in a small cabin until their house that he called the Hermitage could be built. He called it the Hermitage because it was a place he could relax and be a hermit. In 1796, Tennessee became a state, and Jackson was elected to the House of Representatives. He hated every minute of it. He resigned and returned to Tennessee. He was then persuaded to get elected to the Senate, and he did, and he hated that just as much as he hated the House. He returned to Tennessee and was appointed to the Supreme Court of Tennessee. He served there for 6 years, resigned, and returned to the Hermitage. Jackson really wanted a military career, but the governor of Virginia would not appoint him to the Tennessee militia. This angered Jackson, and he challenged the governor to a duel. During the duel, which they had on horseback, the governor fell off his horse and broke his sword. They decided to call it off. This was Jackson's third duel, and it was just one duel of many duels to follow. Jackson finally received a commission in the militia. Jackson was sent to deal with the Indian problems around Florida and dealt with them harshly. Madison appointed him as a general in the U.S. Army and was given the Southern Command. Jackson attacked both the Indians and the Spanish. He even captured the Spanish capital of Florida, Pensacola. In the War of 1812, Jackson was sent to New Orleans to deal with the British. Jackson had a force of around 5,000, and the British had approximately 10,000. Jackson defeated the British, suffering only around 60 casualties to Britain's 2,000. Jackson was an immediate hero. The election of 1824 would see 5 candidates running for presidency: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, William Crawford from Georgia, Henry Clay from Kentucky, and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun would drop out of the race and concentrate on trying to become the vice president. 261 electoral votes were at stake. 131 was needed to win. Jackson received 99, Adams received 84, Crawford received 41, and Henry Clay received 37. Since nobody received 131, the election would go to the House of Representatives. Adams made a backroom deal with Clay to gain support for him. Clay, as Speaker of the House, had enormous influence. Adams promised Clay the job of Secretary of State. The job of Secretary of State was seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had all been Secretaries of State before becoming president. 13 states were needed to win the election. Adams received 13, Jackson got 7, and Crawford received 4. Adams offered Jackson and Clay positions in the administration, but they refused. Jackson was furious and called it a corrupt bargain. This started an absolute hatred between the two men. Jackson's wife died shortly after the election. She had a heart condition, and she was stressed and depressed by all the accusations during the campaign. She was 61. Jackson went back to Tennessee and began planning the 1828 election bid. Jackson was nominated by his party in 1825, 3 years before the election, and would spend his time consolidating support for his run as president. This was the beginning of the Democratic Party, which Martin Van Buren helped to create. The election of 1828 saw Jackson get his revenge on Adams. It was a nasty campaign. Jackson was accused of being a prostitute's son. He was also accused of being a polygamist and a cannibal who ate the bodies of dead Indians. Adams was accused of being a pimp for the czar, an authoritarian elitist who didn't understand the people, among other derogatory remarks that was made of him. This was the real start of a two-party system. More states were allowing more people to vote. Jackson easily won this election, receiving 178 electoral votes, 15 states, and 638,000 popular votes. Adams received 83 electoral votes, 9 states, and 507,000 popular votes. Adams again received virtually all his support from the former Federalist stronghold in New England. Adams refused to have the traditional meeting from the outgoing president. He also refused to attend the inauguration. Jackson opened up the White House to regular people for the inauguration, and it was a disaster, as furniture and china would be destroyed. Jackson would receive a new name, King Mob. Jackson believed the previous administration was corrupt, and investigators found $208,000 missing from the Treasury. In today's money, that is over $8 million in today's dollars. Jackson argued for tighter laws against embezzlement. In his first years in office, Jackson was saddled with the Petticoat Affair. The Secretary of War's wife, Margaret, was accused of being promiscuous and of adultery. Margaret and the Secretary of War were close before her first husband died. This split the cabinet. In 1831, Jackson demanded the resignation of his entire cabinet. He would then use what was called a kitchen cabinet, using non-official advisors to replace the official cabinet. The Indian Removal Act was meant to pay the Indians for their lands on a voluntary basis, but it seldom worked out that way. The United States was trying to remove all Indians east of the Mississippi. It wasn't usually voluntary. Intimidation, force, deception would all be used to remove the Indians, even, of course, violence. It was cruel, but it was a popular policy with the farmers who were able to obtain more land. Another issue was the Nullification Act. This was the result of the increased tariffs that had been imposed by Adams. Jackson would reduce the tariffs, but it wasn't enough. South Carolina wanted to nullify the act, stating that the tariffs would not be enforced in South Carolina. Congress went crazy. They felt that they were the supreme entity when it came to tariffs. Jackson sent warships to Charleston Harbor. They finally came up with a compromise. This caused Vice President Clint Calhoun to resign. Calhoun was from South Carolina. Jackson also went after the central bank. Jackson wanted a decentralized system. He thought it would benefit farmers and small business. The election of 1832 was between Jackson, Henry Clay, a national Republican from Kentucky, John Floyd from Virginia and a member of the Nullifier Party, and William Ritt, an anti-Masada candidate from Maryland. Jackson easily won the election. Jackson received 219 electoral votes, won 16 states, and received over 700,000 popular votes. Henry Clay received 49 electoral votes, won 6 states, and received just short of 500,000 popular votes. John Floyd received 11 electoral votes and won 1 state. He was not on any ballot that had a popular vote. William Witt received 7 electoral votes, won 1 state, and received a little over 100,000 popular votes. Jackson's second term was all about the battle with the National Bank. He had vetoed the bank renewal bill, which Congress passed, and then he distributed federal deposit money among various states. Congress censured him over this. The censure would be expunged in 1837 by a different Congress. Jackson did manage to pay off all of America's national debt. It was the first and only time in U.S. history that we had no debt. In 1835, there was an assassination attempt on Jackson. Both the pistols that the gunman tried to use misfired. Jackson started beating him with a cane until people came and subdued the assassin. The would-be assassin was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was institutionalized. Jackson also let guns and money flow into Texas unofficially during the independence movement in Texas. He didn't want to recognize Texas independence because he didn't think Texas would be able to hold off Mexico. But on his last day in office, Jackson officially recognized Texas independence. His war with the banks caused an economic depression when he left office. He retired to his home, the Hermitage, and remained influential in politics. He died on June 8, 1845, at the age of 78. Andrew Jackson grew up in poverty, but at his peak, he was worth around $150 million in today's money. Thanks for listening.